Hello. In this video we're going to be talking about monetary policy during severe downturns, periods of low inflation, or even deflation, negative inflation. And specifically we're going to be talking about the zero lower bound on nominal interest rates. Now the question is, how do we get into zero lower bound territory? We're going to have once again the output gap on the horizontal axis, the real interest rate on the vertical axis. We're going to reintroduce our IS curve, which tells us about equilibrium in the market for goods and services, and we have our full RT curve. Right now we're in normal times positive territory, zero output gap, but we also have our zero lower bound territory over to the left. Now let's first think about a moderate adverse demand shock. The IS curve shifts to the left. That means lower output. It also means lower interest rates because the central bank is moving along its Taylor rule. It's reducing nominal interest rates in order to stabilize the economy, in order to sort of limit the adverse effect of this demand shock. But we don't cross this bend into zero lower bound territory. Now we have a further adverse demand shock, and you'll see that the IS curve shifts further to the left. We'll notice here that our output gap gets even more negative, and in fact it gets negative by a lot, and you'll also see that the real interest rate is actually higher under scenario 2 than it is either under scenario 1 or the base. Why is that? Because here, while inflation in the background is falling, the nominal interest rate is stuck at 0, which means the real interest rate has to be rising. So that also tells us when we have a cutback in government expenditures, government austerity under the zero lower bound, that means that higher interest rates are going to squeeze out private spending. To see this, let's consider first a situation where the zero lower bound does not constrain, but we have a leftward shift of the IS curve, and moving along again the RT curve, the nominal interest rate brought down by the central bank helps the real interest rate fall, and that encourages more private consumption and more private investment. Now over here where the zero lower bound does constrain, we're already starting off in a period of weakness when we're right around this bend. Then the government is forced to cut back austerity programs, and since the nominal interest rate is stuck at 0, the zero lower bound constrains, the real interest rate rises. So that's going to be crowding out, squeezing out some private consumption and private investment, a kind of paradoxical result. Now let's take a look at the effect of changes in expected inflation under the zero lower bound. Higher expected inflation is going to reduce the real interest rate under the zero lower bound, and that can be potentially good. It can potentially ease the recession. So let's contrast once again what happens when the zero lower bound doesn't hold and when it does constrain. Over here where the zero lower bound does not constrain, if people expect higher inflation, the central bank is going to raise interest rates in order to defend its credibility, which means that the RT curve will shift to the left, we'll have lower output and higher interest rates. Now over here, since we're to the left of the bend, this upward shift of the RT curve is actually a downward shift. What's the intuition behind that? Is the central bank going to raise interest rates? No, because interest rates are already too high. If the zero lower bound constrains, it's the zero lower bound that's keeping those interest rates artificially high. That means that higher inflation, nominal interest rate constant, lower real interest rates, and that's going to help stimulate some private consumption and some private investment. So the intuition there is that if people believe that prices will be going up in the future, they buy today. Let's look in the other direction. deflationary expectations under the ZLB. If the zero lower bound holds, lower expected inflation is going to be increasing the real interest rate, and that can have the effect of intensifying the recession. So once again, let's start off with a situation where there's no zero lower bound. The real interest rate falls as a central bank loosens its monetary policy stance. So the RT curve shifts from this solid blue line out to this dotted blue line, representing an easing of monetary policy with lower expected inflation. As real interest rates go down, more spending by the private sector takes place. Over here, we have precisely the reverse. When inflationary expectations go down, the central bank cannot reduce nominal interest rates. Why? Because nominal interest rates are already at their zero lower bound. The central bank can't reduce interest rates even more. That means that the real interest rate must rise, and that's going to potentially squeeze out some private consumption and some private investment, intensifying what was already a very intense and severe recession. This points up a trap that central bankers want to avoid, and they want to avoid desperately. A vicious downward spiral of ever lower inflation expectations, higher real interest rate, and falling output. The question is how to avoid that trap. And some have suggested that central bankers have to be steadfast in convincing the public that not only do they want inflation to not go too high, they also don't want it to go too low. Effectively, they have to promise more inflation. In 2011, during a period of some economic weakness in the popular press, someone suggested that the Fed chairman, then Ben Bernanke, needed to show his commitment to high inflation. He needed to signal, as it were, his irresponsibility by wearing a Hawaiian t-shirt and carrying a marijuana pipe while conducting monetary policy. This was, of course, a facetious suggestion, but it does point up the problem here, that central bankers can have difficulties in convincing the public that they want to have more inflation. But that's precisely what we need to do sometimes when we face falling inflation expectations under the zero lower bound. We want to avoid this vicious downward spiral. So here are your key takeaways. Central banks can face a zero lower bound during adverse conditions, severe recessions, and deflation. When the zero lower bound constrains and monetary policy is not able to do its job, some paradoxical results can hold. The world becomes upside down, and some would say topsy-turvy. Austerity, cutbacks by the government, cause the real interest rate to rise, not fall as it would during normal times. The zero lower bound effectively restricts central banks from using monetary policy to do its normal job, to stabilize prices and output. During these periods, the government has another option to stabilize the economy, and that would be a fiscal expansion, lower taxes, higher government spending, a rightward shift, effectively, of the IS curve. But if the government wants to be in the position of having this fiscal option on the table during the bad times, it needs to manage its finances soundly during the good times, and specifically it needs to assure that the government doesn't accumulate too much debt. Put differently, it's like households. The government needs to save for a rainy day. Otherwise, when that rainy day arrives, the resources may not be available. Thank you so much.